It began here, on the salt-stained docks of Seattle and San Francisco, July of 1897, when two ships, the Excelsior and the Portland, arrived carrying the glittering promise of the Klondike, gold, enough to rattle the very bones of society. The whispers grew into roars, and roars became a fever. Men and women clamored to hear the stories of riches pulled from the icy veins of the North. Among them stood E.A. Hegg, a man not of pickaxe and shovel, but of camera and lens. He watched, eyes wide, as pandemonium took hold. Merchants barked their wares, strangers became rivals. Men from all around the world met here to begin a 4,000-mile journey north to the gold fields. Hegg felt the pull, not to dig, but to see, to capture this moment when civilization unspooled itself in pursuit of a dream. But even as the frenzy grew, a shadow lingered. For every story of sudden fortune, there were a dozen more of broken men, frozen hands clawing at frozen ground, mud up to the knees, weeks of digging through muck and gravel for nothing. For many, it didn't matter. Gold fever had already taken hold. They heard the warnings of men starving in mountain passes, of graves dug in the snow, but they didn't believe it would be them. They thought they were different, smarter, luckier. This was no journey for the faint of heart or the faint of judgment. The best gold claims were gone before most even left these shores. And yet, like moths to the flame, they all swarmed northward, not knowing they carried their own ruin with them. Hegg locked the doors to his studios, bought all the chemicals and glass plates and paper he could afford, and went to Seattle with his cameras to seek passage to the Yukon. He didn't know it yet, but his photographs would become the legacy of a great human tragedy. The dreams of 100,000 men chasing gold, and the reality of how few ever caught it. There were two routes leading north to the gold fields. The traditional route was a 4,200-mile all-water passage by way of the Pacific, Bering, and Yukon. The shorter and more difficult route, used by 10 times as many Klondikers, was part water, part overland. Skagway was the start of the overland route, leading through the White and Chilkoot passes. They were the only routes passable year-round, and once through them, it was a short journey down the Yukon River to Dawson City. Fast and cheap, this route attracted 90% of the stampeders. Hegg joined a group of men who pooled their resources to charter a small and weathered vessel, the Skagit Chief. The ship was a relic of the 1880s, but for Hegg and his companions, it was their best shot. Skagway, where dreams first met the harsh embrace of reality. This was the first of two land routes leading to the gold fields. Hegg would eventually set up his photo studio here. The early stampeders found no piers, no docks, just the muddy shore where men unloaded supplies by hand. Hegg's camera captured it all, the endless slog of men, ferrying cargo through the mud, wide-eyed with bewilderment, and those unprepared for what lay ahead. With time, wooden piers stretched into the bay, offering a semblance of order. But the frenzy never ceased. The world had arrived. Miners from the hills of California, merchants from New York, prospectors from Europe and Australia. They all funneled into this fragile gateway. To leave Skagway was to step into the mouth of the beast. The trail to White Pass began innocently enough, a winding path through low, muddy terrain, but the trail disappeared and twisted and climbed into the mountains where the air grew thin, the footing unstable, and danger everywhere. The White Pass Trail earned its grim nickname, the Dead Horse Trail. Along its edges, Hegg saw the corpses of animals cast aside, their carcasses picked clean by scavengers. Yet still they pressed on. When a party left for the mountains, it was an occasion. Shouting, cursing, the bark of dogs. Hegg's photos captured dramatic winter scenes on the White Pass Trail as each man carried his dream, or dragged it, pulled it, shoved it, towards the summit. At the summit, the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police stood like gatekeepers. Each stampeder was weighed down by a literal ton of supplies. 1,000 pounds of food, tools, and survival gear, enough to last a year in the wild. Those without it were turned back. Without the proper gear, their chances of survival diminished greatly. And if they did make it to the gold field somehow, the unprepared would quickly become a liability. The descent from White Pass offered no relief. Slipping through the teeth of the mountains, they inched closer to the Yukon River. Daia, a sister to Skagway, though less forgiving. Here, the march to the famed Chilkoot Pass began. This was the second and most famous overland route to the goldfields in Dawson City. At first, the stampeders leaned on the wisdom of the land's original stewards, the local indigenous peoples, who guided them through the first leg of the wilderness. But even with their help, it was clear most were unfit for the trials ahead. Some turned back before the mountains even came into view. Others pressed on, driven by nothing more than stubborn hope or madness. Some called it gold fever, that thing that allowed men to submit to the most appalling conditions, to sacrifice their life savings and their lives if need be, out here with strangers in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Hegg's most famous photos from the gold rush could be these. It was here, at the Chilkoot Pass, that Hegg captured the soul of the stampede. The Chilkoot Pass loomed above like a trial by fire, a steep, punishing climb that demanded everything and more. 1,200 icy steps worn into the mountainside, a lockstep procession of men and equipment moving only as fast as the slowest man. Hegg positioned his camera to capture the men clawing their way up the icy incline, carrying their supplies bit by bit. A single line of men silhouetted against the endless white, their bodies bent under the weight of their supplies, greed, fear, and desperation. They called it the Golden Staircase, but for many, it was an altar where their dreams were sacrificed. The trail was too narrow and too steep for beasts, leaving only human backs to bear the burden. 20, 30, 40 trips up and down and back again, carrying a literal ton of supplies, bit by bit. At the top, the mounted police waited. They weighed supplies and judged men. For some, this was the end of the road. The required ton of goods meant dozens of trips up and down the pass, weeks of back-breaking toil. Many stood at the summit, staring into the void of their own limitations, and turned back. During his time in the area, Hegg moved between the two trails. A place called Log Cabin was where the White Pass and Chilkoot Pass trails intersected on the journey deeper inland to the Yukon River. This became his hub, a place to keep his supplies, develop his photo plates, and plan his next journey into the madness. The lakes, Lake Bennett, Lake Lindeman, and Lake Marsh, were the final gateway to the Yukon River. Every man bound overland for the gold fields had to cross these waters, no matter the season or the conditions. In winter, the ice froze solid, creating a temporary highway for sleds and weary stampeders. In spring, the thaw turned the lake into a challenge of navigation, and by summer, it bustled with makeshift boats called scows bound for the Yukon River. At the southern end of Lake Bennett, a tent city sprang to life. It was a gathering place for thousands, resting, resupplying, and preparing for the next leg of the journey. By the summer of 1898, this settlement had grown into a semi-permanent community with traders, blacksmiths, and carpenters. Supplies were bartered, meals were shared, and news exchanged about conditions further north. The surrounding hillsides, once thick with trees, were cleared to feed the booming boat-building industry. Hegg captured the scene in vivid detail. Rows of men sawing through logs, hammering boards into place, and inspecting freshly cut timber. Sleds, no longer needed for the ice, were dismantled and transformed into scows, sturdy, flat-bottomed boats designed for carrying supplies downriver. For many, this was their first time building or even handling a boat. Hegg's photographs showed the crews preparing to set out. Some experienced sailors, others complete novices. These scows, rough-hewn and overloaded with supplies, were the lifelines that would carry their fortunes. The lakes posed challenges year-round. In winter, crossing the ice was slow and dangerous, with supplies weighing sleds down. Spring brought the risk of thinning ice and frigid water, while summer winds and unpredictable weather tested even the strongest boats and men. Hegg's younger brother and their friend joined the group and pooled their resources. It was decided that the young Hegg and his companion would begin building a boat for their trip across the lakes and down the Yukon River, while Eric Hegg would continue earning money for the group, making pictures. Ahead lay the Yukon River, winding hundreds of miles toward Dawson City and the goldfields. And then the real work would begin. The Yukon River, the final stretch of a grueling journey. Hegg stood on its banks, his lens capturing the men who had made it this far. Scows floated past, carrying hopes and fortunes, though some already showed the strain of the journey. Not all relied on scows. The sternwheeler industry had sprung to life, ferrying men and cargo to Dawson City. These towering boats, with their roaring engines and spinning wheels, symbolized efficiency for those who could afford the passage. For the rest, the riverbank became their path. Hegg photographed them, walking mile after mile, knowing their arrival might be too late to claim the gold they sought. The Yukon spared no one. Whether by river or by foot, every man carried the weight of his ambition and the growing certainty that he was chasing a dream already out of reach. Dawson City, a place bright with hope and dark with despair. The banks of the Yukon River were a mess of wrecked boats and abandoned supplies, a graveyard for the last desperate push of the stampeders. Men came ashore with fire in their veins, certain their fortune lay just beyond the muddy streets. By tomorrow, they thought, their dreams would be in hand. What began as a collection of tents on the flats soon grew into a booming town, one of the largest and most unruly settlements in the north. At its peak in 1898, Dawson's population swelled to nearly 40,000, its streets alive with traders, miners, and opportunists. The lucky ones had already claimed the richest ground. For the rest, Dawson was a place of survival. Many ambitious men realized their fortune lay not in the mines, but in mining the miners. General stores, saloons, and supply depots sprang up overnight, their shelves stocked with goods ferried in on the river. But Dawson was far from stable. Each year, at least once, the town burned. Fires ripped through the wooden structures, reducing entire streets to ash. Hegg's camera was there. And yet, Dawson always rose again. The town was rebuilt every time, its growth fueled by stubborn resilience and the endless stream of stampeders still pouring in. This was it, the final destination, the place where every trail, every hardship, every dream led. Hegg arrived at the goldfields expecting to find the heart of the rush. What he found instead was its bones. The hills that once stood untouched, their creeks running clear, had been scalped to the bedrock. Small streams, first prospected by the lucky few who arrived early, were now choked with debris. The beauty of the Klondike was gone, peeled away in a frantic search for wealth hidden beneath the earth. Men lived on their claims in filthy camps, too afraid to leave for fear of losing their stake. They built crude, dangerous engineering projects, sluices and flumes that diverted water to wash away gravel and expose the gold beneath. They toiled from dawn to dusk, their bodies breaking under the weight of exhaustion and cold. The richest claims had been staked months before, long before the rush reached its fever pitch. Many of these men worked for wages on claims owned by others, indentured to fortunes they would never see. They came seeking glory and freedom, but found only servitude. The gold fields of the Klondike weren't organized, they were crammed. Claims butted up against cabins, shops, and each other, right on the edges of town. No zoning, no real boundaries, just state ground, marked by wooden posts and hand-drawn maps and hope. But look past the chaos, and you'll see a kind of frontier ingenuity. Every claim was a small operation. Many looked like construction sites. Long wooden flumes carried water in from creeks miles away, often built by hand, using only axes and saws. Ditches were dug through frozen ground to feed the sluice boxes that washed the pay dirt. To get the gold, they had to thaw the permafrost. Some lit fires straight into the earth. Others used steam boilers and coiled pipes to melt the frozen layers inch by inch. Once the ground was soft, they dug shafts, sometimes 30, 40, 50 feet deep. Buckets of gravel were winched to the surface with hand cranks or pulley systems, then dumped into rockers or sluices. Timber cribbing kept the shafts from collapsing. Everything had to be reinforced, especially in winter. It was rough, and it barely worked. Claims were close, tensions were closer, but the work itself was steady, methodical, and for many, the only real chance they had at a payout. In total, the Klondike Gold Rush yielded over $29 million in gold, roughly $1 billion today. Most of the gold was discovered early, in the first few months after its initial finding in 1896. By the time the masses arrived in 1897 and 1898, the best claims were already gone. A few struck lucky on smaller creeks, but most found nothing. or worked themselves to ruin on someone else's land. For those who made it out, the journey home was often as punishing as the journey in. Others stayed, not because they had found fortune, but because they had nowhere else to go. This was the gold rush. This wasteland of mud and ash, stripped of its beauty, was the end result of all the stories and songs. Where was the glory? Where was the gold? Gold fever. It was never just about the gold. It was a sickness of the soul, a hunger for something more. Freedom, power, redemption. It drove men to forsake reason, risk everything, and blind themselves to the truth. The fever didn't just burn through their wallets, it consumed their lives. E.A. Hegg captured the truth of the Klondike, the cost of ambition, the fragility of hope, and the devastation left behind. His photographs told a story of human resilience and of human folly. This was the dream they risked everything for, a place where beauty became ruin and hope turned to ash. And still, they came. Through his eyes, we remember the story of the Klondike. Not the gold, but the men who sought it, and the cost they paid. E.A. Hegg gave us that memory, and for that, he remains a legend of his own.